Chapter 1. Everyone in that courtroom thought the outcome was obvious. My sister looked confident. My parents sat behind her like witnesses to a future they had already decided, and I stood there in silence, the woman everyone assumed would give in. They thought my quiet meant weakness. They thought family love would pressure me into surrendering my own home. My name is Rowan Mercer, and that day, without raising my voice, without arguing, without explaining myself, I let them believe every assumption they needed to make. Because the truth was, the case was never built on facts. It was built on who they thought I was. My sister looked straight at the judge like she already owned the room, and then she said it calm as if she were reading a grocery list. "Finally, that house is mine." She did not look at me. She did not need to. Behind her, my parents sat shoulder to shoulder, perfectly still the way they always were when they thought they were on the right side of history. My mother's lips pressed into a tight, satisfied line. My father's chin lifted just enough to say, "This is how it was always going to end." I stood at the defendant's table alone, my hands folded in front of me, because I did not trust them not to shake. The courtroom in Jefferson County felt smaller than it should have. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a seal on the wall that made everything feel official and distant, the kind of place where your life gets translated into paperwork, and the people who hurt you get to call it concern. The bailiff had told us to rise when the judge entered. Everyone did, like a single wave. I rose too, but it felt like my body was doing it without my permission. I was aware of every movement, every scrape of a shoe, every rustle of a folder. I was also aware of the way eyes landed on me and slid away as if they had already decided what kind of woman I was. The quiet one, the one who gives in, the one who does not make trouble. My name is Rowan Mercer. I am 39 years old. I work in operations for a regional supply company outside Denver. I pay my bills on time. I have never been arrested. I have never raised my voice in a courtroom. I had done everything you are supposed to do to be taken seriously, and still I could feel the room leaning away from me toward my sister, toward the story she was about to tell. My sister Tessa was 43 and built for certainty. She wore a navy suit that fit her like a promise. Her hair was smooth, her posture flawless, her expression soft in the way that reads as reasonable to strangers. She was the kind of woman who could smile while cutting you open, and people would thank her for being honest. On the bench sat Judge Evelyn Grant, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of calm you do not mistake for kindness. She began flipping through the file in front of her with that practiced speed judges have fast enough to show she has done this 1,000 times slow enough to remind you she controls the clock. Tessa's attorney spoke first. He stood with an easy confidence as if the outcome was already printed. He talked about family, about fairness, about shared understanding. He described me with that gentle tone people use when they are about to take something from you for your own good. He said I had struggled with the responsibility of managing property alone. He said I had expressed feeling overwhelmed. He said my sister had stepped in lovingly to help. When he said those words, I felt my stomach tighten, not because they were entirely false, but because they were carefully misused. I had been overwhelmed. I had been tired. I had said the words, "I do not know if I can do this late at night," standing in a kitchen that still smelled like old wood and dust. My hands stained with paint. My phone balanced on my shoulder while I tried to hold a broken cabinet hinge in place. But what I meant was, I do not know if I can do everything alone. And what my sister heard was, I can use this. The house at the center of this case sits on Brookline Terrace in Arvada. It is not a mansion. It is a narrow, older home with a sloped backyard and a creaky porch, the kind of place that would have been overlooked by most people until the market went wild and everyone started treating square footage like gold. It belonged to my grandmother, and when she died, she left it to me. That part was simple. The rest was not. Tessa had filed to claim control of it, arguing that I had agreed to share ownership and then reneged. She framed it as protection. She framed it as family stepping in when one member could not handle something big. She framed me as fragile. And the worst part was that my parents agreed in writing with signatures that looked steady. From where I stood, I could see them behind her. My father, Rowan Mercer, 67, with his hands clasped like he was at church. My mother, Denise, 64, her eyes fixed on the judge as if she was praying for an easy verdict. They did not look at me. I was a person they had already placed in a category long ago. Responsible, emotional, difficult when I pushed back, easier when I stayed quiet. Tessa's lawyer turned slightly, addressing the bench and the room. He said this was not greed, it was concern. He said my sister had tried to work with me privately. He said I had refused reasonable oversight. He used words like stability and best interest and family support. Then Tessa stood, and the room changed. It always did when she stood. She faced the judge with her hands gently folded, her expression earnest. "I love my sister," she said. "I really do. But she has always been sensitive. She takes things personally. She gets overwhelmed, and when she gets overwhelmed, she shuts down. I just want to make sure she does not make a mistake she cannot recover from." Sensitive, mistake, recover from. Each word landed like a thumb pressed into a bruise. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me. There was a faint scratch in the wood, a thin line someone else had made years ago, probably without meaning to. I stared at it, because if I looked at my sister, I might react. And reacting was what they wanted. They wanted me to stumble into emotion and confirm their story. Tessa continued. She said I had told her I could not handle the house. She said she offered to share the responsibility. She said I agreed. She said I later withdrew because of stress. While she spoke, I could feel the room swallowing it. A woman who looks polished and sounds calm is believed by default. A woman who is quiet and standing alone is interpreted as defeated. It did not matter that I had paid for the repairs myself. It did not matter that I had spent weekends pulling up warped flooring, calling contractors, learning which permits were required, working my day job, and then going to the house at night to sand and patch. It did not matter that I had receipts organized in folders, insurance statements, tax records, documents that proved responsibility. At that moment, what mattered was the story in the air. I could hear my own breath, slow, controlled. I kept it that way on purpose. My attorney sat beside me, a calm presence, but silent. That silence was not neglect, it was strategy. We had decided that the first part of today would belong to them. Let them paint their picture. Let them commit to it. Let them overreach. Judge Grant listened with her face unreadable. She made notes. She flipped pages. She asked no questions at first, and every second she stayed quiet seemed to make Tessa bolder. My sister's voice softened further, turning concern into performance. She glanced toward me, once the smallest tilt of her head, like she was checking to see if I would break. I did not. When it was time for the judge to speak, my throat tightened anyway. Not out of fear of the truth, but out of exhaustion. There is a special kind of tired that comes from being told who you are by people who benefit from you believing it. Judge Grant looked down at the file again. She turned a page, then another. Her pen tapped once on the paper, a crisp little sound in the silence. Finally, she paused. Her fingers stopped mid-turn, and for the first time that morning, the air felt different. She lifted her head, and her gaze moved past Tessa, past the attorney, past my parents, and settled on me. "Ms. Mercer," she said, "you have been very quiet." Every face in the room turned. I could feel it like heat. Tessa smiled slightly, the kind of smile that expects a stumble. I knew that smile. "I had grown up with it," Judge Grant continued. "Before I can rule, I need clarity on a point that is central to the plaintiff's claim. This alleged agreement to share ownership, when exactly was it made?" Tessa's attorney answered quickly. "Around last spring, Your Honor. During a private conversation between the sisters." Judge Grant nodded once, then looked back at me. "Ms. Mercer, Do you remember such a conversation? My heart thudded once heavy. I took a breath and let it out slowly. I felt my attorney shift slightly beside me, ready, but still giving me space. Yes, I said. Tessa's smile widened. My mother's shoulders loosened like she had just received good news. Judge Grant's eyes did not change. She asked the next question as if she were placing a piece on a chessboard. Do you remember agreeing to transfer ownership of your property? I looked at my sister then, just long enough to see the confidence in her face, the certainty that I would follow the familiar script and apologize, soften, explain, give her something she could twist. I turned back to the judge. No, I said. It was a small word, but it landed clean. I heard it in the room like a door closing. For the first time since we walked in, Tessa's expression faltered. Not enough for anyone else to call it panic, but enough for me to recognize it. That slight flicker when a person realizes the ground under them is not as solid as they thought. Judge Grant made a note. She looked down again, her finger moving along a paragraph as if she were listening not only to the words spoken aloud, but to something in the paper that did not match them. And then in that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. My silence had not made me weak. It had forced them to talk first. It had given them room to overcommit. And now, with the judge's attention fixed on details instead of impressions, the story they thought would carry them was starting to show seams. I kept my hands folded. I kept my posture steady. Inside something that had been clenched for years, loosened by a fraction. If you want to understand how we got here, I thought you have to understand the role my family assigned me long before the house was ever mine. You have to understand how many times I was told to step back, how many times I learned that peace meant my silence, and how without realizing it, they came to believe my life was something they could manage. Judge Grant flipped another page slower now. I stayed quiet and waited for the past to catch up to the present. Chapter 2. I grew up learning where I fit long before anyone ever asked what I wanted. In our house in Lakewood, Colorado in the early 90s, everything had an order that never needed to be discussed. My sister Tessa spoke first. I waited. Tessa decided. I adjusted. Tessa was praised for knowing her mind. I was praised for being easy. At family dinners, my father would lean back in his chair and listen to Tessa talk about school friends, plans she had not yet made but already believed in. He would nod along, proud and relaxed. When I tried to add something, my mother would smile and tell me to let my sister finish, not unkindly, just efficiently. As if conversation was a schedule and my part had been penciled in smaller. I learned early that interrupting was rude when I did it and confident when Tessa did. If we disagreed, my parents framed it as concern. They said I took things too personally. They said Tessa was just being honest. They said I should not let little things upset me. The little things added up. When we were teenagers, Tessa chose which movies we watched. If I suggested something else, my mother would sigh and say we did not need an argument. If Tessa took my clothes without asking, my father would shrug and say, "Sisters share." When I asked for them back, I was told to stop being dramatic. I was not dramatic. I was learning. I learned that peace in our family came from me stepping aside. I learned that being agreeable kept the room warm. I learned that resistance, even quiet resistance, made things uncomfortable in ways that were somehow always my fault. Tessa did not need to push. The system did that for her. By the time we were adults, the roles were so established they felt like facts. Tessa was the capable one, the leader, the person you trusted with responsibility. I was reliable but fragile, dependable but sensitive, good at following through as long as someone else set the direction. When my grandmother Helen Mercer passed away in 2016, I was 31. Tessa was 35. Grandma had lived alone in a narrow house on Brookline Terrace in Arvada for as long as I could remember. It was not glamorous. It creaked when you walked across the living room. The roof leaked during heavy rain. But it was steady. It was hers. The will was read in a small law office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. When the attorney said the house was left to me, there was a brief pause. Not shock, not anger, just a quiet recalibration. Tessa laughed lightly and said, "Well, that is unexpected." My mother tilted her head and asked if that was really what Grandma intended. My father cleared his throat and said she probably assumed Tessa would help manage it. No one said I did not deserve it. They did not need to. The assumption floated in the room on its own. Afterward, in the parking lot, my mother touched my arm and said, "We will figure something out." Tessa added that she could help if it became too much for me. The word "if" did a lot of work. I moved slowly. I did not sell the house. I did not ask permission. I kept my job in operations at a distribution company outside Denver and spent evenings driving to Arvada, unlocking a door that stuck and standing in rooms that still smelled like my grandmother's soap. I started the renovation in 2019. I hired contractors when I had to and learned to do things myself when I could not afford them. I replaced cabinets. I sanded floors. I applied for permits and waited in line at city offices. I paid every invoice. I kept every receipt. My family did not visit. They did not ask how it was going. When I mentioned being tired, my mother said I did not have to push myself so hard. When I said I had already committed, my father said I always did too much. Tessa never came by. She never asked about timelines or budgets. She did not need to. The house was not interesting yet. By late 2021, the work was done. The porch no longer sagged. The roof held. The kitchen had light again. In 2022, the market shifted, and suddenly Brookline Terrace became valuable in a way it had never been before. That was when the phone calls started. Tessa called one evening and asked how the house was doing, her voice bright in a way that made my stomach tighten. She said Mom and Dad were talking about fairness. She said it was strange that I had all that equity when family was supposed to share. I reminded her that the house was left to me. She said, "Of course, but families do not always plan for reality." My parents echoed her concern days later. My mother said she worried I might feel overwhelmed again. My father said Tessa had experience with real estate and could help protect me from making mistakes. Protect. Help. Fair. The language had not changed. Only the stakes had. Looking back, the shift was obvious. When the house was a burden, it was mine. When it became an asset, it was suddenly ours. Not through hostility, through suggestion, through concern, through the familiar tone that implied they knew better. There was never a moment where someone said, "Give it to your sister." There was no raised voice, no slammed door. There was just a steady pressure, a quiet expectation that I would do what I had always done. When I hesitated, my mother asked why I was being difficult. When I said I needed time, my father said Tessa was only trying to help. When I pointed out that no one had helped pay for the renovation, the room went cold. That was when something shifted in me slowly without drama. I realized they did not hate me. They were not trying to hurt me. They simply did not see me as someone whose decisions stood on their own. In their minds, my life was manageable, adjustable, subject to review. The house was just the latest version of that belief. Standing there in this courtroom years later, watching my sister frame herself as my protector, I finally understood the pattern in full. Every time I stepped back, they took a step forward. Every time I stayed quiet, they filled the space with their version of what was best for me. What they called love had always come with conditions. Be agreeable. Be grateful. Do not complicate things. I had followed those rules my entire life without realizing they were rules at all, and now, for the first time, I was not following them. The memory settled into place like a missing piece, not with anger, with clarity. I saw how easily concern could become control, how fairness could mean redistribution, how silence could be mistaken for consent. The past was not catching up to the present, it was explaining it. I let the understanding sit there heavy and undeniable as the courtroom faded back into focus in my mind. The house was never just a house. It was the moment they expected me to step aside again, and this time I had not. Chapter 3. The papers came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a man who looked apologetic before he even said my name. I had just pulled into the parking lot outside my office in Lakewood when he stepped forward holding a manila envelope like it weighed more than it should. He asked if I was Rowan Mercer. I nodded, already feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. He handed me the envelope and said he was sorry, as if that might soften what was inside. The return address belonged to a civil court in Jefferson County. I sat in my car for a long moment before opening it, the engine still running, the radio murmuring something I could not focus on. When I read the first page, my hands went cold. Tessa Mercer versus Rowan Mercer. Seeing my sister's name printed above mine felt different from hearing it spoken. It looked deliberate, official, like a line drawn where none had existed before. The claim stated that I had verbally agreed to share ownership of my grandmother's house and later withdrew that agreement due to emotional stress and incapacity. Incapacity. That word stayed with me long after I finished reading. I drove home without stopping anywhere, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat, like a living thing. That night, I laid the papers out on my kitchen table and read them again slower this time, trying to understand how concern had turned into litigation without anyone ever saying it out loud. I called my mother first. She answered on the second ring. I did not get past hello before she said, "Rowan, this does not have to be ugly." I asked her why my sister was suing me. She sighed, the sound heavy with practiced patience. "She is not suing you. She is trying to make things fair. Fair to who I asked." "To the family," she said. "You know how overwhelmed you get. Tessa just wants to help." I told her I had never agreed to give up ownership. There was a pause long enough for me to hear my father in the background. Then my father took the phone. "You are being stubborn," he said. "This is bigger than you. Your sister has experience. She knows how these things work." "So do I said quietly. He laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively. "You work in operations. That is not the same thing." The call ended shortly after that, not with a goodbye, just with a click. Within days, the rest of the family weighed in. My Aunt Carol left a voicemail telling me I was tearing everyone apart over a house. A cousin texted that I should think about how this would look. Someone else said lawyers only make things worse. Every message carried the same suggestion disguised in different tones. Let it go. Be reasonable. Do not embarrass anyone. None of them asked what I wanted. At work, my days continued as usual. I ran meetings. I managed schedules. I solved problems that had nothing to do with my family. My boss stopped by my office one afternoon and told me she appreciated how steady I had been during a recent crunch. I thanked her and went back to my screen. It struck me then how strange it was that the people who knew me best professionally never questioned my ability to handle responsibility, while the people who shared my last name had decided I could not be trusted with my own life. I did not announce my decision. I simply made one. I did not argue with my parents. I did not defend myself to relatives. I did not call my sister to demand an explanation. I stopped explaining altogether. Instead, I started organizing. I bought a file box and labeled folders with careful handwriting: receipts, permits, insurance, property tax statements, emails, text messages. I printed everything. I backed it up. I did not comment on any of it. When Tessa texted me, I did not reply. Her messages started polite. "I just want to talk." Then they turned pointed. "Mom is really upset." Then impatient. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." A week later, the voicemail came. Her voice sounded tight, irritated in a way I had never heard before. "You need to be smart about this," she said. "You know you cannot handle this alone." I saved it. I contacted a lawyer named Daniel Brooks after a coworker quietly passed me his card. Daniel did not promise outcomes. He asked questions. He listened. He took notes. When I told him about the so-called verbal agreement, he did not react. He asked when it supposedly happened. He asked who was present. He asked why there was no documentation. Then he said, "Do not respond to them anymore." I asked if that would make me look uncooperative. He shook his head. "It makes them show their hand." At his suggestion, I also met with a certified public accountant named Mark Rivera. We sat in a small office that smelled faintly of toner while he reviewed my financial records. He confirmed what I already knew but had never needed to prove before. Every dollar spent on that house had come from me. Every tax payment. Every insurance premium. "This is clean," he said. "You have nothing to worry about on that front." I nodded, feeling something like relief tempered by the knowledge that this was not about numbers. It was about narrative. As weeks passed, the tone of Tessa's messages shifted again. She called late at night. She left voicemails that sounded less polished, more frustrated. "You are really going to let this go to court," she said in one. "After everything we have done for you, I listened to that message twice. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified something. She believed my silence meant confusion. She believed I was frozen, waiting for guidance. She believed I would eventually fold the way I always had. She did not understand that I had finally drawn a line." My parents called again separately this time. My mother cried. My father warned me about consequences. I let the calls go to voicemail. At no point did anyone ask me how I was doing. They asked how long this would take. They asked how much it would cost. They asked if I realized how this made the family look. The lawsuit moved forward. One afternoon, Daniel forwarded me an email from opposing counsel requesting additional documentation. The tone was confident, almost casual, as if the case were already decided. Daniel replied with a simple acknowledgement. "We will provide relevant materials through proper channels. Nothing more." When the court date was set, I marked it on my calendar and went to work the next day as usual. I did not feel brave. I felt focused. On a Friday evening, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail from Tessa. "This is getting ridiculous," she said. "You are embarrassing yourself." I sat on my couch and listened to it in full. Then I labeled the file and added it to the box. That was the moment it clicked fully into place. The more I said nothing, the more she revealed. The more patient I became, the more desperate her tone grew. Concern was slipping. Control was showing. Silence had never protected me before. It had only made me easier to manage. This time it was doing something different. It was forcing everyone else to move without me smoothing the edges. I closed the file box and slid it under my desk. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, I was not trying to convince anyone of who I was. I was letting their assumptions run until they ran out of room. And somewhere between the unanswered messages and the carefully saved voicemails, I realized something else. They were telling their story louder and louder. I was not telling mine at all. I was waiting. Chapter 4. The room felt tighter the second time we walked in, as if the walls had moved closer while we were gone. I took my place at the table again, hands folded, posture straight, eyes forward. Nothing about me looked different from the last hearing. That was intentional. Across the aisle, Tessa sat beside her attorney, shoulders back, chin lifted. Confidence still clung to her, but it no longer looked effortless. It looked practiced. Judge Evelyn Grant entered, and we all stood. When she took her seat, she did not waste time on pleasantries. She adjusted her glasses, glanced down at the file, and nodded once. "We will continue," she said. Tessa's attorney stood first, smoothing his jacket as he faced the bench. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has always acted out of concern for her younger sister. This case is not about ownership in the traditional sense. It is about protection." I watched him speak without reacting. I had heard this version of the story before, only now it was being delivered with legal language instead of family concern. He continued describing me as overwhelmed, emotionally strained, incapable of managing a valuable asset alone. He said my sister stepped in when she saw me struggling. He said there had been an understanding between us, an agreement born of trust. When he finished, Tessa stood. She turned slightly toward the judge, hands clasped, voice calm. "I never wanted this to go this far," she said. "Rowan is sensitive. She has always been that way. She shuts down when things get stressful. I just wanted to make sure she was not taken advantage of." Behind her, my parents nodded, not dramatically, just enough to reinforce the picture. My mother's mouth trembled as if holding back emotion. My father stared at the floor, the image of a man burdened by responsibility. It was effective. It always had been. I stayed quiet. Judge Grant listened without interrupting her pen, moving in short, precise strokes. When Tessa finished, the judge leaned back slightly. "Ms. Mercer," she said, addressing my sister, "you mentioned an agreement." "Yes," Tessa said quickly. "We talked about it last spring." Judge Grant tilted her head. "Last spring would be after the renovation was complete." Tessa hesitated for half a second. "Yes." And before that, the judge asked, there was no discussion of shared ownership. Tessa smiled a little too quickly. It did not seem necessary at the time. Judge Grant made a note. She turned her attention to me. "Ms. Mercer, she said you have been largely silent. I want to be clear on a few points. When was the first time your sister expressed interest in controlling the property?" I took a breath. "After the market value increased," I said. Tessa's attorney objected, but the judge raised a hand. "Answer stands," she said. She looked back at me. "Did your sister contribute financially to the renovation?" "No," I said. "To taxes or insurance?" "No." Judge Grant nodded again, slow and deliberate. She turned to my attorney. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel stood. "Your Honor, he said we would like to submit documentation supporting Miss Mercer's statements." He approached the bench and handed over a stack of organized files. Receipts, permits, bank statements, tax records. Judge Grant flipped through them, her expression unreadable. Across the room, I felt Tessa shift. Her confidence tightened like a knot being pulled too hard. Judge Grant looked up. "Ms. Mercer," she said, addressing my sister again, "you testified that your concern arose from your sister's inability to manage the property." "Yes," Tessa said. "And yet the judge continued, all financial obligations appear to have been met consistently by Ms. Rowan Mercer." Tessa's mouth opened, then closed. "I was helping in other ways." "How?" the judge asked. "With advice," Tessa said. "Guidance." Judge Grant leaned forward slightly. "Do you have documentation of this agreement? Emails, messages, anything?" Tessa glanced at her attorney. "We have a written summary of the understanding," he said, producing a document. Judge Grant examined it. Her eyes narrowed. "This document is dated several months after the alleged agreement," she said, "and the signature here does not match earlier records." The room went quiet. Daniel stood again. "Your Honor, we also request to submit a forensic review of that document." Judge Grant nodded. "Proceed." As the evidence was presented, I watched Tessa's composure begin to crack. Not dramatically, subtly. She shifted in her chair. Her hands tightened. She stopped making eye contact with the judge. Then Daniel introduced the voicemails. Judge Grant listened through a headset, her face still. I could not hear what she heard, but I remembered every word. When she removed the headset, she looked directly at Tessa. "In these messages," she said, "you urge your sister to act quickly. You reference consequences. You suggest she cannot handle this alone." Tessa's voice rose before she could stop it. "I was trying to motivate her." "Motivate," Judge Grant repeated. "Or pressure." My mother inhaled sharply behind her. Judge Grant turned her attention to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Mercer," she said, "you both submitted statements in support of your elder daughter's claim." They nodded. "Were you aware that your younger daughter had solely financed the renovation?" My father hesitated. "We assumed Tessa was involved." "And were you aware," the judge continued, "that the request to alter ownership occurred only after the property value increased?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We just wanted what was best." Judge Grant nodded slowly. "That may be," she said, "but this court must concern itself with facts, not intentions." The shift was unmistakable now. Tessa leaned forward, her voice sharper. "This is not fair," she said. "She is taking advantage of a technicality." Judge Grant looked at her, unblinking. "Ms. Mercer, she said your claim rests on an assumption that concern grants control." The words hung in the air. I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, recognition. For years, my family had mistaken my silence for agreement. They had mistaken patience for permission. Now, in a room governed by evidence instead of dynamics, those assumptions were collapsing under their own weight. Judge Grant closed the file in front of her. At this point, she said, "The court has serious concerns regarding the plaintiff's motivation." No one spoke. My sister stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. My parents sat frozen, their certainty gone. The room felt heavier than before, thick with what had just been exposed. Judge Grant adjusted her glasses once more. "I will take this under advisement," she said. The gavel did not fall. There was no declaration, just a pause, deliberate and final. I remained still, my hands folded, my breath steady. For the first time since this began, the story being told was no longer theirs, and the silence in the room belonged to me. Chapter 5. The decision came in a short envelope that arrived 3 weeks later, thick enough to feel final before I even opened it. I stood at my kitchen counter in Lakewood, with the window cracked open, the sound of traffic drifting in, and read the ruling once, then again, slower. The language was precise and restrained, the way legal writing always is when it ends something personal. The court denied the claim in full. I retained sole ownership of the property on Brookline Terrace. The judge also included a warning, clear and unambiguous, against further attempts to pressure or interfere with my rights as owner. There was no flourish, no apology, no acknowledgement of emotional harm, just facts and conclusions bound together by authority. I set the papers down and waited for the rush of relief everyone talks about. It did not come. What I felt instead was quiet, a deep, unfamiliar quiet like a room after furniture has been moved out. I was not shaking. I was not smiling. I was simply still. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from my mother sent 10 minutes after the ruling was posted online. She said she hoped we could all sit down and talk soon. She said families should not end like this. I did not respond. An hour later, my father called. I let it ring until it stopped. Tessa did not reach out at all. In the days that followed, the absence of noise became noticeable. No voicemails urging compromise. No texts about fairness. No relatives asking how I could live with myself. It was as if the pressure had evaporated the moment it no longer had leverage. At work, nothing changed. I attended meetings. I met deadlines. A colleague congratulated me on a successful rollout, unaware that my life had just shifted on an axis she could not see. That was when it hit me. The house had never been the center of my life. It had just been the place where everything else came into focus. The following weekend, I drove to Arvada for the first time since the hearing. The street looked the same. Trees lining the sidewalk, a dog barking somewhere behind a fence. The porch steps still creaked in the same spot. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint and old wood the way it always had after the renovation. Sunlight filtered through the front window and landed on the floor I had sanded myself late nights after work, hands-sore music playing low so I could think. I set my bag down and stood there listening to the quiet. This was the part I had imagined would feel triumphant. Walking into a space I had defended legally, confirmed as mine. But triumph was not the right word. What I felt was ownership without tension. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where I had balanced my phone on my shoulder while holding cabinet doors in place. The living room where my grandmother used to sit with her coffee humming softly. The spare room that still held boxes I had never unpacked because I was never sure how permanent I was allowed to be. That was the difference now. I sat on the edge of the bed in the back room and let myself think about what I had lost. I had lost the illusion that my family would choose me when it mattered. I had lost the comfort of being agreeable. I had lost the role I had been trained to play, and in exchange I had gained something I did not know how to name until it was mine. Space. Space to make decisions without approval, space to disappoint people and survive it, space to stop explaining myself. There was no reconciliation dinner, no heartfelt call where someone finally admitted they were wrong. My parents kept their distance. My sister disappeared from my daily life entirely. For a while that hurt more than the lawsuit ever had. Then it stopped hurting. I realized that closure does not always come with resolution. Sometimes it comes with acceptance, not the kind that forgives, but the kind that sees clearly and moves forward anyway. That evening, I sat on the porch steps and watched the sun dip behind the houses across the street. I thought about how often I had been told to keep the peace, to be the reasonable one to make things easier for everyone else. I thought about how expensive that peace had been. The court had given me a ruling, but the real shift had happened long before the judge ever spoke. It happened the moment I stopped trying to be understood and started acting as if my choices did not require consensus. I did not win a house. I got my life back. As the light faded, I stood and went inside, closing the door behind me. Not to shut anyone out, but to mark the boundary I had never been allowed to draw before. If you have ever been told that staying quiet was the same as being kind, or that keeping everyone comfortable mattered more than keeping yourself whole, you probably recognize this feeling. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people be disappointed and keep going anyway. I turned the lock, set my keys on the counter, and stood in the middle of a home that was finally undeniably mine. And for the first time, I did not feel like I needed permission to stay.